Chapter 10 today, we come to a particularly hard topic. Jesus is asked a question by the Pharisees about divorce, and Jesus answers that question. Now, the reason I say that this is a hard topic is because, 43% of marriages in Australia actually end in divorce. And so that means that there won't be people, it's highly possible that there are people in this room which divorce has actually touched. Either their parents were divorced, or they have been divorced, or one of their children have been divorced. And so we're not discussing a theoretical subject this morning, we're discussing something that actually touches people's lives very, very personally. And so I want you to know right from the outset that my purpose in speaking about this is not to add to anyone's burden, or not to put guilt and shame upon anyone, but rather to bring the healing message of Jesus into our lives. Now, the way I want to break up this passage this morning, if you just look at Mark 10, is I want to break up this passage into 4 parts. First, the Pharisees say, let's talk about divorce, verses 1 to 5. Jesus then responds and says, no, let's talk about marriage, verses 6 to 9. Then his disciples say, wait, what about remarriage? And finally, I want to end by talking about the gospel. So let's talk about divorce. No, let's talk about marriage. What about remarriage? Actually, let's end by talking about the gospel. So first, let's talk about divorce. Notice down in verse 1, Mark begins this way. He says, he left there. The there is in reference to Mark 9, verse 33. Jesus was in Capernaum, in the north, in Galilee. He left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again, and again, as was his custom, he taught them. Now, it's important to know the geography of the region, because Mark in his gospel uses geography in order to push his action forward. So Jesus has been teaching and performing miracles in the north of Israel and Galilee, and now he's going south down into Judea. In the next chapter, in chapter 11, he will enter into Jerusalem. And then Mark slows down the action, and we have the final days of Jesus before the crucifixion and the resurrection. And so what we're going to see in chapter 10 is that the cross looms large over every conversation and everything that happens. And so it's within this context, in verse 2, that the Pharisees came up, and Mark says, in order to test him, asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, in order to understand this passage, we need to understand the context and tone, because context and tone are so important. I mean, this is not a broken person whose marriage hasn't worked out coming to Jesus and asking him for counsel. This is the self-righteous religious leaders coming to test Jesus. The self-righteous religious leaders who we've seen all throughout Mark's gospel. In Mark chapter 2, they questioned whether Jesus had the authority to forgive sins. In Mark chapter 3, they were watching Jesus on the Sabbath as to whether he would heal a man with a withered hand. And now here, they've set up a test for him. In a little over a month, Bella is going to be taking her driver's test. You can pray for that. I'm hoping that she passes her driving test, because I calculate that I'll get back about 4 or 5 hours of my week from having to drop her off at various places. But when she does that test, she's going to do a parallel park, and she'll do various maneuvers to see if she's got the skills to be on the road. And as I said, I'm hoping that she passes. But this test that the Pharisees are bringing to Jesus is not a test to see whether he passes. It's more of a trap. You see, as it says in verse 1, Jesus had moved down to the region of Judea. And King Herod was the king in Judea. And in Mark chapter 6, we saw that John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, had had his head beheaded because he had told Herod that his marriage to his brother's wife was unlawful. And so I think what the Pharisees are doing is that they are setting a trap for Jesus. They're hoping to stir up controversy. They're hoping that this will get back to Herod. And just what happened to Jesus' current cousin, John the Baptist, he got beheaded. They're hoping that Jesus might get in trouble as well. But they're asking the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, when we we hear the word lawful because we live in a secular society. We just interpret it through like legal terms. But in Israel, a highly religious society, this question should be more framed like this. Is it morally permissible for a man to divorce his wife? Is God okay with divorce? And Jesus asks a clarifying question in verse 3. He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, verse 4, "Well, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." They're quoting here, or they're referencing here in the law in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. Now, what they're getting Jesus to step into is a debate that was raging among the rabbinical schools of the time. On the one hand, the school of Shammai, they were the more conservative school, they sort of taught that you could only write your wife a certificate of divorce if she was unfaithful, if she committed sexual immorality. The more sort of liberal school was the school of Hillel. They said you could divorce your wife on any grounds. If she burnt the dinner, or if you found her no longer attractive, you could actually divorce your wife. Now, it's interesting that the Pharisees, who were conservative on almost every other thing, actually sided with the liberal school of Hillel on this issue. And so they were sort of stirring this up for Jesus. What is Jesus going to say? If he sides with Shammai, he will sort of sideline the Hillelites. If he sides with Hillel, he'll sideline the Shammites. So what is Jesus going to say? Well, Jesus says, you are actually both wrong, you conservatives and liberals. Look at how he responds in verse 5. Jesus answered them and he said, "Because of the hardness of heart, he wrote you this command." See, you are thinking that this is your right, that God is giving you a right here to divorce your wife. But Jesus actually says, no, this was not a right. This was actually a concession that God had made because he knew what life would be like in a fallen and broken world. Now, when you actually read Deuteronomy 24, it's really, really interesting. Let me just summarize what it says just for brevity's sake. So this is how the law goes. It says, if a man looks without favor upon his wife because he finds something indecent in her, and he writes a certificate of divorce and he sends her away, and another man marries her, and then he writes her a certificate of divorce, or he dies, then the first man is not able to remarry her again. That's the law. So let me just summarize it again for you. If a man sends his wife away, writes her a certificate of divorce, another man marries her, he writes her a certificate of divorce, or he dies, the first man is not able to remarry her. Now, what is this law doing? What's this law all about? Well, most scholars actually believe that what God is doing in this law is he's actually forbidding a form of human trafficking, where men would actually divorce their wives for payment and offer their wives to another man who would then marry their wife. And then after they had slept with them, the next day they would divorce them and they would remarry them. It was actually a form of prostitution, all under the guise of being legal, of being righteous in God's eyes. So do you see what God is actually doing? He's actually putting limits around a horrific practice to protect the vulnerable, to protect women. You see, divorce, as Jesus is going to go on to say, was actually never part of God's plan for human relationships. The Pharisees say, let's talk about divorce. Jesus says, no, let's now talk about marriage. Look at what Jesus goes on to say in verse 6. He says, but from the beginning, God created them male and female. You want to go back to to Deuteronomy? I want to take you right back to Genesis. From the beginning, God created male and female. You know, marriage is a man between one man and one woman. God says that in the beginning, God created male and female, two genders, different yet the same. Now, God made two genders because and brought them together in marriage because this reflects the character of our God. You see, our God is triune, which means he's three persons, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, but he's one in essence. So he is the same, and yet they're different persons in the Godhead. And this is reflected in marriage, in when a husband and wife come together. They are different. A man is not a woman is not a man, but yet they come together in the covenant of marriage, and they come together as one. Then Jesus goes on to say this in the next verse, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. When you get married, you leave all other earthly allegiances and you join yourself to your spouse. You are now committed to them. You become part of a new family. And then in verse 8, Jesus says, and the two shall become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one flesh. Marriage is a comprehensive union. It's a union of soul, where your souls come together. It's a union of life, where you now share your lives with one another. You now share your finances, you share your children. You have to be considerate of what the other person does in their life. And obviously, sexual intimacy is a representation or a picture of that oneness. That act shows is a demonstration of the two becoming one in the sexual act. And then Jesus finalizes this by saying in verse 9, therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate. What God has joined together, let no man separate. You see, marriage is more than just a legal contract. Marriage is covenant. It's interesting that this week I actually had the privilege of signing some paperwork for a couple who were getting married. And I said to them, as they were signing the paperwork, I said, all the law cares about is if you can legally be married. And to be legally married in Australia, you need to be above the age of 18, you need to be not married to anyone else presently, and you need to be not marrying your brother or sister. That's in Australia, that's all it takes to get married, and all the government cares about is the legal contract. Jesus says that marriage is something different to that. Marriage is a covenant. When a couple come before their church family on their wedding day and they make vows before God and before one another, something beautiful happens where God takes the two and he binds them together as one. As they join their hands together in marriage, there is God's hand that is coming down and joining them together. And that is why when a marriage dissolves, it's painful. It's not just the ending of a legal contract, like you come to the end of your phone contract and you get another phone. It's not like that. When a marriage ends, it's really, really tragic. And for the people involved, they feel the sting of that ending for their whole lives, because it's much deeper than just a legal contract. It is a covenant for God. So do you see what Jesus is saying to these self-righteous Pharisees? They're wanting to just divorce their wives for any reason. And Jesus is saying, no, God set up these laws not as a right for you to have, but just as a concession to set limits around an evil practice that you were doing. And right from the very beginning, that's not what he intended. He intended human relationships to be a lifelong covenant between a husband and a wife that God has made. So we've talked about divorce, we've talked about marriage. Now let's talk about remarriage. But what about remarriage? The disciples, after hearing this in verse 10, they come to Jesus again about this matter. It says in verse 10, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So Jesus is basically saying here that if you get an illegitimate divorce and then you marry someone else, you not only commit the sin of divorce, but you compound that by committing the sin of adultery. So that if you divorce, then you get remarried, and you are then actually sinning against that previous partner, because in the eyes of God, you are still married to them. That's what Jesus is saying. Now I know these are hard words. These are hard words. How are we to understand these words? But one of the things that I want you to recognize is that there are some legitimate exceptions in the Bible that God sets up for why someone should get a legitimate divorce. For example, over in Matthew chapter 5, which is the Sermon on the Mount, and Matthew 19, which is the parallel passage to Mark 10, Jesus himself says that you can divorce if your partner is unfaithful to you. If they commit an act of sexual immorality, then that is grounds for divorce because they are breaking their marriage covenant with you. There is also in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul also gives us another exception. He says in 1 Corinthians 7, if you are a believing spouse and your unbelieving partner leaves you and they desert you, then he says you are free, obviously then free to remarry. You're no longer bonded to that marriage covenant because once again the principle is that they have severely broken that marriage covenant. Now I would say to you, as a pastor who's been dealing with people for many years, that this principle that if someone doesn't treat their marriage covenant seriously and has broken it, this principle that Jesus teaches in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, and 1 Corinthians 7 with Paul, I think that can be applied to other situations of extreme abuse, to situations of violence in the home. I just want to read you just a passage from this book on remarriage and divorce, where an ethicist from the Southern Baptist, he writes this. His name is David Gushie. He says, one cannot find a biblical text in which burning a child or wife on the arm with a cigarette, or throwing them down the stairs, or banging their heads against the wall, or enlisting them in a murder plot is listed as grounds for divorce. Such actions, however, constitute a fundamental assault on the meaning of marriage covenant. Given the usual pattern of physical abuse in which an abusive spouse periodically apologizes or excuses the behavior, but without commitment to serious counseling and does not change, I believe that God would hold us responsible to accept a pattern of abuse as grounds for divorce, and thus on the argument above, also for remarriage. So what I am saying is that I believe that these exceptions not only relate to adultery and not only relate to a desertion, but if there is severe abuse in a marriage, and a breaking, even emotional or physical abuse, breaking the marriage covenant, then I think it is actually biblically wise for that person to separate and to get a divorce. When I was in Adelaide as a pastor, there was this poor young lady, and her husband was just emotionally manipulative and abusive, and we had tried to counsel him over the years. He had refused to accept counsel. He treated his wife and his children horrendously. We had put him under church discipline. That was still no good. And so our suggestion to her was that she needed to separate from him and she needed to get a divorce. She ended up actually remarrying a man who was divorced in our church, whose wife had left him. And they today have a beautiful marriage and have a wonderful marriage. I can't see how Jesus would be against that in the passages in which he teaches these things. So let me just say it really, really clearly so everyone understands that if there is abuse in relationships in this church, we as elders, if it's physical abuse, we'll be reporting it to the police, but also we will be walking alongside of hurting people, and it may be biblically wise for that person to separate and get a divorce. Can I be any more clear? So that's me making it very, very clear. So, but then what do you make of Jesus' strong words here? What do you make of Jesus' strong words? Well, I think what you have to make of these strong words is that remember the culture in which he's speaking. He's speaking into a culture which is very permissive of divorce. In fact, over in Matthew 19, when the disciples heard the words of Jesus, they said, well, then maybe it would be better off if we weren't married. That's how shocking it was to them. And so I think what Jesus is doing, like he does all throughout the Gospels, is he speaks in very shocking terms in order to get our attention, in order to make us realize. And what he's actually going for here is the permanency of marriage, the importance of marriage, the beauty of marriage as God's intended design. So we have talked about marriage, we've got divorce, let's talk about marriage, let's talk about remarriage. And I know we're going to go into the gospel in a second, but before we do, I just want to give a little aside. Can I do that? Can I go on a little tangent? My little tangent in this passage too is just to notice how countercultural Jesus is in elevating women in this passage. Do you see what in verse 2, the Pharisees come and they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? If they're just seeing it from a man's perspective. Notice in verse 6, Jesus highlights that from the beginning God created them male and female. They both have equal value in the eyes of God. And down in verses 11 and 12, when he talks about remarriage, he doesn't just say it from a man's perspective, he also says it from a woman's perspective, which would have been countercultural in the ears of people at that time. And I just have this quote here from the Lachlan that I'd like to read. Can you just put that up? Is that in the PowerPoint? This is a beautiful quote. It says, "The way Jesus treated women tore up the belief that women are innately inferior to men, a belief that was persuasive in the ancient world. In Jesus we find a man who never had a sexual relationship, but who loved women so well that they would leave everything to follow him. As I'm just saying, we find a man who turned his back on the religiously powerful men of his day and had his longest recorded private conversation with a religiously despised woman. If we read the Gospels through first century eyes, Jesus' treatment of women will knock us to our knees." That's what we see in this passage. This beautiful, beautiful way that Jesus treats women. And so we've talked about divorce, we've talked about marriage, we've talked about remarriage. Now let's talk about the gospel. As Tegan read out in the passage in Ephesians 5, Jesus quotes, or Paul quotes from Genesis as well, and says, "The two shall become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one." And Paul says, this mystery is profound, and I am talking about Jesus and the church. You see, our marriages are meant to be pictures of Jesus and the church. And aren't you so grateful for such a faithful husband like Jesus? Jesus has every reason to divorce us. We are often unfaithful spouses to him. James says, "You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God?" And so many times we're unfaithful to Jesus, but Jesus was always faithful to us, and his faithfulness went all the way down. It went right to the cross when he died for us and all of our sin. And so this changes everything, because Jesus wants to bring beauty out of brokenness. That's why he came, to bring beauty out of brokenness. And so now I want to address a number of people in this room. Number one, if you're here this morning and you were divorced because someone sinned against you, I want you to know that Jesus weeps with you, and that he is the faithful spouse that will never leave you. He will never forsake you. How good news is that? How good is that? The second thing I want to say is that if, as you read these passages, you realize that you probably did get a divorce for the wrong reasons, for hardness of heart, not for maybe biblical reasons, I want you to know that divorce is not the unforgivable sin. You know, what we often do in the church is we put a scarlet letter on people who have been divorced, and they wear that, and they're filled with shame, and they're filled with guilt over what has happened in the past. You know, there isn't a person in this room who is righteous. There is not a person in this room who has ticked all the right boxes. We are all sinners. We all need the grace of God. And so hopefully this church can become a place where we can honestly bring out our pasts and the difficulties and the things and the mess of our lives and see them remade through the gospel, through Jesus. But finally, I want to speak to those of you who this morning, in their marriage, your marriage might be in a tough place. You might be in a really tough place. You know, Tegan and I, we got married at the ripe old age of 19, really, really young. And she brought her junk into the marriage, and I brought my junk into the marriage. And after 1 year, the first year was a great first year, but by year 5, we were on the doorstep of divorce. She had gone to live with elders in our church, and I was living in our little rental, and it looked like our marriage was over. Our marriage was done. But what really helped us during that time was recognizing that God was at the center of our marriage. You know, I think the words of what Jesus says here in verse 9 can be really, really healing. It says, Jesus says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. God has joined you together, even in the hard times. If you believe that God has joined you together and that He has a purpose, then you can endure those hard moments. You can bring your hardness of heart, which is often what gets in the way of relationships, is our hardness of heart. We feel like we've been wounded. We feel like the other partner's the only one to blame. And we can bring our hardness of heart to God, and He can actually cleanse our hardness of heart. I remember another occasion when Tegan and I were fighting, when we had actually remodeled our kitchen. Remember that, Mark? Remodeling your kitchen can almost send you to the doorstep of divorce. And it was like, and I've been in pastoral ministry for like 6-7 years as the senior pastor, and here we had this massive fight, one of many that we could probably mention. And I was sitting outside of our home, just on the bench, just nursing all these grudges against her. Like, she's done this, she's done that. And I rang my good friend Tracy Johnston. I don't know if you know this thing. I rang Tracy. And Tracy, who is our pastor, who is our senior pastors in Perth, her and her husband were our pastors over in Perth when I was an associate pastor there. She just talked some sense into me. She said, Timon, stop it. Stop that grief and those things. You want to be the hero of this story. You want to go in there and you want to love her and put these things aside. You want to be the one who actually forgives and loves. You want to be the hero of this story, Timon. Just go in there and love her. And that's what we did. And so we got over remodeling our kitchen. But that can happen in marriage, can't it? Is our hardness of heart that leads to divorce in marriages. And there might be marriages in this church that why you would never contemplate divorce is not a very happy marriage. You need the love of God to come into your marriage. You need that spouse who will never leave you nor forsake you to fill you with His love so that you can love your partner and not become hardened towards them, holding and wrestling grudges that will eventually lead you to bad places. So let's all just pray for our church and pray for the various states that we're in. We have different people in different situations. I don't think I would have answered all of your questions here this morning. Maybe you disagree with me on some of the points in which I made. That's okay, we can talk about it later.